All right, hey everybody. This is Kurt, jumping back in, picking up where we left off yesterday. We talked about code quality yesterday. Today we're going to be talking about code discovery. It's a pretty interesting topic that you actually don't hear too much about, but it's something that's very important in a larger environment. We're going to talk in depth more about why. I'm going to give another minute here just to see if some more people filter in. In the meantime, just give a little personal background, a little information about myself. So my name is Curtis Kemple. I am a tech lead at Major League Soccer. I've worked there for coming up on a year now. I've been dealing with JavaScript / Node for quite a long time now. Also, yeah, you can find me on Medium, Twitter, GitHub. Also, another thing, there's a repository that kind of goes along with this webinar. A lot of the things that I reference are actually in use here. A lot of the tools and stuff that I use, it's kind of a bit of a playground for basically looking at what it takes to kind of set up like an enterprise web service. And so this whole course kind of talks about parts of this repo is kind of the culmination of all of these moving parts and putting it together. Also, while we get started, there are a couple polls. The first three, you're more than welcome to jump in and fill out at any time. It just kind of gives me a little background information and helps me kind of set the tone for the webinar. Obviously, we could save the last one for the end, unless you just want to go ahead and vote now. All right, so I'm just going to get started. I'm going to talk about, this is going to be a bit of a repeat in the very beginning from last night, but I just want to take a minute to talk about this again, because I feel like the word enterprise gets thrown around a lot. And I kind of want to clarify, there's no de facto standard for what defines something as enterprise, but just to kind of give you some ideas about what may or may not be really an enterprise environment. So one of the things, more like an enterprise JavaScript environment, when you can say that you're using Node or JavaScript at the enterprise level. So one of the main definitions used to describe an enterprise system is something that powers business critical systems. Now, to me, that term is a bit outdated because pretty much everything now is powered by some type of service or website or SaaS platform, and it's pretty much all tech-based. So we can't really use that too much because, well, everything is. But if you just have, one API or one, UI that you're maintaining and working on, or if you're at a small startup, and haven't built up a lot of code, it doesn't really feel like enterprise, even though it is business critical, right? Like the entire business is running on it. Can you say it's enterprise Node if it's largely a JavaScript environment? In other words, you're using more JavaScript than other languages. Yeah, that's a pretty good indication that you're getting, into the enterprise level. But again, that can be misleading if we have two services and they're both written in JavaScript, but it's a very small amount, and we're running a pretty smooth ship with just a couple applications, maybe a couple node modules, that might also not be enterprise. Does it all have to be Node to be enterprise? No, I would say not that. I would say what really defines enterprise is just when you have a large amount of JavaScript that you have to maintain as a company. Anytime that the amount of JavaScript actually can force you to rethink processes and have to build better solutions for building, testing, deploying your applications, creating patterns, repeatable patterns to spin up new services and do that. If you maintain a lot of internal tooling and internal node modules, it's like a clear sign that you're starting to get to an enterprise environment, right? Like just a ton of software. So the topic of today, so yesterday we talked about code quality. and why that's so important. So, now you're writing this beautiful code and you're monitoring your code, but you're still churning out a lot, right? So, you've used these tools to increase velocity. You're starting to be able to release features faster, and then more packages, more, generalizations start to pop up. We export things out into their own packages. You start to end up with a lot of JavaScript. You have 4 different admin UIs for 4 different services. You start to end up with like a lot of these applications. And if your code is not discoverable, if it's not easy to find, you end up with a lot of pain points that really kill velocity, mainly code duplication. We're going to talk about that more, but that's pretty much the #1 thing. If people aren't aware of code that exists and are unable to find it or don't know how to use it, they're just going to write it. And this can cost, a lot of time. All right, so we talked just a little bit about why code discovery is important, but I want to kind of go into a little bit more depth. So we already said that it prevents code duplication. This is pretty important. Code discovery, now, real quick, this also refers to locally in a single project. Code discovery is also equally important there. It's very common that you'll see code that's very similar, or even literally copy and paste it around an application. And this is, code duplication. And if the code was presented in a way that was a bit more discoverable, maybe there was a little bit more documentation on how to use it, some examples, it wouldn't have been written again or just like copy and pasted elsewhere. It would actually become generalized and reusable. So just the idea of making code more discoverable in nature improves documentation because it can't be discoverable without documentation, right? Like there has to be a way to identify it, to tag it, has to be a way to explain what it's doing. So just by working to make code more discoverable, we're also already working to improve processes. Another great thing is if you're in a larger environment, it improves cross-team communication. A lot of times, teams will end up responsible for certain services, packages. They will basically take ownership of these. And it's up to them to define an API, and then it's up to everyone else to understand that API and use it. Now, an API is a contract. So basically, you're saying that this is what I'm willing to give to you, and here's what you can give to me. So already, anytime that a team may need a feature added to a different service or package, there's already that API, that contract there, and so then the teams, when they talk about it, you're actually just talking about building out that API. So it really does keep both teams on the same page. So now that we know what the benefits are, you have to kind of build this from the beginning. You have to start from the ground up and kind of work towards it. Not that you can't gradually get to a better place where you're doing it, but it's just something that you want to think about when you're building packages, especially like individual node modules, things that are going to be published and be reused. You want to actually put a lot of thought ahead of time, because what happens if these practices and patterns are in place, JavaScript offers very fast velocity, right? Like a high rate of churn. You can just spit out things like, I made a bot that closes Greenkeeper IO pull requests for me when they come in if they pass my builds. If the build is green, it will automatically merge it and delete the branch. It's like 125 lines of JavaScript. So when you have that ability to build services, in 2 days, 3 days, you end up with just a ton of software. And so if you're not thinking about naming conventions and APIs and documentation, what you end up with is a lot of code that no one really knows how to use or what to do. So you just end up with a ton of duplication. So we always want to build for discoverability. So what that means, it's breaking it up into multiple parts. So starting with the first part is defining the API. The API of a public module or even a service is extremely important. It's extremely important to get right because it's very hard to change after the fact. And it's very important because if you get it wrong, you're going to make the tool, service, etc., extremely difficult for people to use. And again, this is a hit to velocity. And with JavaScript, the whole point of it, and the reason why we're trying to adopt this into enterprise and make it a thing is because of the speed it gives us, the amount of code that we can get out with less resources. So naming conventions should be intuitive. So what that really means is once I start to walk through the API, the rest of it should be pretty easy to kind of figure out. And then it should also help give me a bigger picture. A good example of this is React. React has a very specific API about things. Everything basically comes down to a component. And then from a component, will a component, will mount, component did update, component will unmount. You start to see like there's this pattern, right? And it becomes intuitive to know, oh, okay, so we're talking about a life cycle of a component. It has multiple states. It will do these things or it did do these things. So then you start to understand the API, and then now working through it becomes second nature. It's intuitive. You don't have to think about it anymore. It just starts to come naturally. The API should be as simple as possible. I love jQuery for this example because they were really at the forefront of taking very complex JavaScript and making it simple. Now, they're really known for normalizing JavaScript across environments, but what kind of got swept under the rug because of that fact, which was also great, is that they were excellent at the facade pattern. jQuery's API is very simple to use. It's very easy to pick up. I mean, actually back when I started with JavaScript, it was towards the end of the prototype days coming into jQuery, and jQuery was like the first thing I learned, right? Like, and it was like that for a lot of people, and even still to this day, sometimes it is. Before I really mastered JavaScript, I was breezing through jQuery stuff, and of course that brought more natural learning of JavaScript. But yeah, I mean, because the API was so easy to use and so friendly, it was, and you were actually doing very complex things in a manner that was, a few lines of code, where before it took, files upon files of JavaScript. So they did a great job at making it very simple. And again, so because if we're not defining good APIs, it's really the API is like your first level of documentation. Actually, I shouldn't say first, really a level of documentation. But yeah, it's definitely like one of the first things that people are going to look at, right? When you go and look at the docs, you're looking at the API. And it's really a good way to expose to people when it's well defined what it is that your library, module, service, etc. does. So now that we've talked about basically naming APIs and how to handle just making that part of our application discoverable, we have to also make the package itself discoverable. It's equally as important for me to be able to find the module at all, let alone be able to figure out its API or know, what's inside of it. So naming conventions, again, should be intuitive, right? Like I know this is getting repetitive, but it should start to build patterns where I can kind of just say, oh, okay, I know I need components. I know that's under org UI components. And I know this might look a bit Java-y if anybody has a Java background, or even, really any language that makes use of namespaces, but, and you don't have to follow the dot pattern. You can use dashes or whatever preferred method you want. But the idea is that there should be logical groupings. If if we have, you know, internal packages that we're using everywhere, we want to make sure that, you know, other teams and developers can have easy access to them. So, you know, we're going to talk a bit more about registries in a little bit, but being able to search, you know, in a registry and find something quickly, you know, if anybody's experienced, you know, searching with NPM, when you really need something that's a bit not commonplace, it can be a bit frustrating. You know, you get thousands of results for things that are kind of related, but not related because they wanted to use a name that really means something else, but sounded cool. So, you know, you know, you want to keep away from that type of thing with packages. Now, if you're releasing something open source, you know, feel free to get a little, you know, a little bit more funky with it, but you still want it to at least somewhat relate to what that package or framework is doing. So naming conventions need to be consistent, and this is why it's important to think about these things up front when you're getting started. If we develop 3 different patterns for naming our modules, every time I search, now I have to like try and search through 3 different ways. Basically, you just end up in, you might as well as not developed a pattern at that point, because you're just going to end up with that same kind of, you know, spaghetti of modules. It's not really clear how to navigate. And if you start to see yourself getting in that path, you should really push hard to get some like kind of domain meetings together. So I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with the principle of domain-driven design, but basically it's where you try and take the business and model it, and then you try and break the software apart into these models, and it really helps with your naming and understanding of different contexts of different parts of the business. So naming convention should be descriptive, right? So this comes back to being intuitive, really, but it really needs to describe exactly what it is. So we have UI.components. Now I could have just stopped there and just had components, like, you know, this umbrella, and then maybe gone under that, you know, and started breaking up, you know, down different paths, but you want to try and keep the name as descriptive as possible. So I might have like buttons or forms, and then, you know, you could have all different types of things. Like you could have different headers, a date picker. I mean, you know, obviously the list goes on for the type of components that you can make. But now this is also a tricky subject, because really there's about 50 different ways that you could do it properly. And there is no right or wrong way. It's just a matter of coming to a consensus on one and just moving forward with it. This is also another area where bike shedding really likes to pop up. Naming conventions are very hard. Naming things is a very difficult part of software. And that's why domain modeling is something that's so important, because it really helps you get a better understanding of what people refer to the parts of your business as. So it needs to be descriptive in a way that makes sense to whoever's going to be using it. You know, maybe components and forms is not the right way. Maybe it's actually broken up by organization, application, you know, something like that. I found, though, now that we have so much JavaScript that we actually have to go above the application level. And we reuse components like forms and things like that across all types of different UIs. And I'll talk about how we maintain that type of dependencies in a little bit. So another huge part of making code discoverable is documentation. There's multiple ways to document, right? So we said a clean API is your first level of documentation. You can also say that tests are another level of documentation, because by looking at the tests, I can see exactly what I'm expecting to come out of this module, or, you know, for it to take, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes, which I talked about complexity a little bit yesterday, sometimes you might be dealing with software that's a bit complex. Maybe you're writing an adapter that integrates with a third-party you know, service that is like just legacy and has really bad API. So you're doing things that are interesting and different, where it looks like they should be similar, but you're doing that to accommodate, you know, an outside service, right? Like these are the type of things that you want to document. People will need to understand that difference and why we've broken out of our patterns that we had. Anything that's public should have some form of documentation. A lot of times this can be auto-generated just by reading comments. Sometimes you can just basically even now start to like use types and generate documentation off of types, which is really cool. But basically, if it's public and it's intended to be used by anyone or anything outside of the module that it resides in, it should have some type of documentation, even if it's a few lines in the README on how to use it. In one example, there should be some type of documentation. When you can, provide example usages. I mean, we see this all over the web with open source. You know, you go to any popular, you know, xyz.js, and they're gonna not only tell you why they made it and what it's for, but they're gonna show you how to use it. You know, there's nothing like some type of visual reference when you're getting started with something. So whenever it's possible, show the example usages. And the more information that you can provide about the what and why, the better. However, you know, you don't have to write books about it, right? Like the idea is to keep the code to be the first level of documentation, and then we just accent with things when they need more clarity. So, you know, if you find that writing documentation and updating your tests for a quick 2-minute change is taking you a long time, it's actually a bit of a code smell, right? So we're actually taking something that's supposed to be beneficial and letting it become toxic. We're letting it actually hurt our velocity. It's a fine line and a gray area, and there's no one right amount for anything. It all just depends. You really want to kind of relate it to the complexity. The more complex the tool, the more documentation it should have. So a good example, React, Babel. These are tools that are very, very complex. And so they have just, you know, pages upon pages of documentation. However, if you go find like the node module that generates a random string, you can imagine that it, you know, it just has a couple lines in the README, and that's sufficient because there's a direct correlation between the complexity of the software and the amount of documentation needed to cover it. So types are a form of documentation. While it's not perfect, it does offer more flow than more context than even just being cleanly written and having good variable names and good method names and a cleanly defined API, because you know exactly what, you know, each method or what each you know, statement type is supposed to be. So, you know, you have a couple different levels of this. You have flow, which lets you be very loosey-goosey with what you type check and then get as strict as you want. Or then you have something like TypeScript, which is just a complete subset of JavaScript and is completely typed, and you can actually define your types even outside of the actual having to read the code. So it's great because you can generate documentation and stuff off that. So another big part of making packages discoverable and easy to use is semantic versioning. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with semantic versioning, there's actually SEMVAR.org, and I'm going to drop this link into the chat so that you can read up some more. But basically this states that when we make updates to software, it's important that we follow a pattern to inform users, downstream users, of what exactly it is that we just changed. What is it in the software that's different, and how can we represent this in a way that can be used anywhere? So what a lot of people are using is semantic versioning, or SEMVAR for short. So basically, the quick gist is, I'm not going to get into like pre-releases and alphas, but you have a major, a minor, and a patch. So a patch is you fix the bug. There's no changes to really the actual code. no changes to the logic. You're just updating documentation or fixing typos or fixing bugs, things of these natures, updating dependencies, these type of chores that's deemed as a patch. Then you have a minor update, which is maybe there was some refactoring done, there were some things done, but the public-facing API for the software has not changed. And then you have major, and it's known that when there's major, that means basically it's breaking. That means the public API that you've been using has changed, and there's something different that you have to do to use that piece of software. So this is a fantastic tool, that can really help when you're actually trying to deal with a large amount of JavaScript, because for number one, it allows for individual updates or atomic updates. So if I have my UI components forms and we change the way that we handle, we're posting to new endpoints for our forms or something like that of any nature, we can make the change. Then we can update it here. So we use SEMVAR, so we update the version. And then all of the downstream dependents or things that are depending on this package that have it as a dependency have the ability to update in their own time, right? So, not everybody is forced to update as soon as you update. It just helps create a looser coupling between the dependencies. So then other teams, depending on your software, can start adding it to their backlog once your work is done. Okay, now we need to update to use this. It's going to change that. And SEMVAR really lets them know also the amount of work, right? Like how much work is this going to be? Oh, it's just patches. It's just patches. Everything should be fine. Then we can just update. Oh, it's a minor. Okay, we want to be on the lookout. Make sure we don't catch any bugs or anything, see anything weird, but we should be okay. And then major, new API, let's see what we got to do. It helps show the maturity of the module. So you're pretty much guaranteed that if it's below a version 1, you should be expecting breaking changes when you're using that software. It means the software is not really developed yet. It hasn't been fully defined. It's still a work in progress. Once you start getting beyond version 1, you know that this software has a bit more maturity. It's probably going to be a bit more stable. Now, with JavaScript, obviously things can change very fast, but you just have an idea that you're not going to be getting these huge breaking changes. No one's going to have an epiphany and say, scratch all this, let's start over and rebuild it, So there's a little bit more safety. So now I know if I'm like, oh, we have this, internal module, and it looks really new. Let me see if, I can just whip up something quick, keep my eye on it, and see how it progresses as it goes. Sometimes they fade away. Sometimes people publish things in a hurry and then say, you know what, I don't, this might be too specific, or, this, that. So it just allows you to protect yourself. And it forces thought into updates. So a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this big time, you always go in mind to do one commit, change one thing, but then you start Boy Scouting and you're like, oh man, like, this could be so much cleaner, and oh man, look at that, I can remove some lines of code here. And before you know it, you have like 7 commits, you've added, half of a new feature, refactored some things, fixed 2 bugs. When you're following SEMVAR, it really forces you to slow down and say, okay, so we're going to be releasing a patch, so I'm just going to deal with bugs, just going to deal with dependencies, blah, 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 blah. So it helps you also schedule your workload. So now that we've basically gotten through APIs, documentation, and semantic versioning, so now we have these node modules. Yay, they're all documented, they're all beautiful and pretty, and we're using SEMVAR, but like, now where do we put them? Right, like this is another major problem that a lot of companies face when you start moving into enterprise, is that once you're in enterprise, you start having a lot of private modules, a lot of private code. And you obviously don't want to put them on NPM, which is a public registry, unless you're doing org or enterprise, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it leaves you in a position of needing to store your own packages. However, that's not the only reason to store packages. And so we're going to talk about how having your own registry can actually help you in a multitude of ways, but least of all, or least important of all, actually, is having private modules. It does a lot of actually other things that will save you in the long run. When there are certain edge cases that happen when you depend on third-party and public module storages. So one of the first things I want to talk about is Sinopia. And so it's an open source private registry. So basically think of NPM, but just open source. You set it up, you run it, you host it, but it behaves exactly identical to NPM. You're actually using NPM, and you just tell NPM to look at your registry instead of its public registry. Now, by doing that, by looking at your private registry, you also get caching of NPM modules. So if we've set up Sinopia and we we add a .npm rc file to our project and we point npm at our private registry, what it's going to do is it's going to look at the private registry, and the registry is going to say, oh, I don't have these dependencies yet. It is in turn going to go get them from npm, and then it is going to bring them in and cache them, just like npm does, and store them in your registry. So now the next time that you install those dependencies, and it does have caching timeout, so you don't have to worry about getting stale modules and stuff. But instead of going to hit npm, it's just going to hit your internal registry because it has a copy of these. So one thing that may not seem obvious about this, actually two things, but are really awesome, is number one, you're now most likely going to be on a much faster network when you're installing npm modules. And so if anybody has ever tried to do that somewhere in like public or at the airport or something, like, it's a nightmare. So it can really speed up build times, which is fantastic, especially, if you're doing, builds per commit or per pull request. You don't want to be jacking up build servers or like waiting on 15 other builds. So it gives you that benefit. The second benefit it gives you is it makes you better able to handle situations like left pad. So I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that. So basically what happened was a while back, there was a guy who had quite a few NPM modules. He got in a bit of a beef with Kik, the company Kik, because he had a module with the same name. And basically NPM, after being harassed by Kik's lawyers, told the guy, hey, like, you have to give up the rights to the name of that module. Well, he didn't take it very well, and he pulled all of his modules off of NPM, just unpublished all of them. So not that big of a deal, except one of them was called left pad. And all this module did was you gave it a number and you gave it the size of the digits that you wanted it to be, whether it be end up total being 4, 5, 6, etc. And then it would just add zeros to the left to pad that number until it had the right amount of digits. And that's all it did. But by unpublishing it, it broke React, it broke Babel, it broke a multitude of modules that pretty much everybody in the JavaScript ecosystem was relying on. So Twitter's blowing up and everything's blowing up. Medium had 1 million open letters and closed letters, and people hated JavaScript and then they loved it again. But point being is that it caused a lot of grief for a lot of companies. Anybody who was running their private registry, like we were at the time, we weren't affected. We had React, we had those previous versions already cached in our public registry, so we were protected. Now we were protected twofold because we also use Docker to build our applications. So we install all of our dependencies and then store our containers in another Docker registry. And I'm actually going to talk about that in a future webinar, actually. I believe that's going to be the 4th one, deploying with Docker. And actually, I'll talk about it some in securing your environment as well. But yeah, so it gives you the ability and protection against issues from third-party services, NPM. So another great ability, because now we're talking about enterprise, and a lot of times in enterprise you have certain restrictions. Like we actually have to vet some node modules and make sure that the things that we're using don't have vulnerabilities. So now we don't whitelist or blacklist. We actually just use Node Security Project to do vulnerability testing, and we will talk about that in securing your environment. But it is something that you can do through Sinopia. So if your company had, pretty strict rules, like maybe you're doing financial, or something in healthcare or government, where there's, very fine restrictions on software that you're able to use, you can whitelist certain modules so that, developers won't even be able to install any modules other than ones that are whitelisted. And the other thing that it gives you is just an internal search. So now you can take your private modules and they're searchable. You have a registry just like NPM. You can just, look up, but you get to filter out all the noise. You're just looking at your internal stuff, which is fantastic. And so you can find it right on NPM. The package name is Sinopia. So I recommend check it out. It's very easy to spin up. You could just spin it up right on your local machine. And there's tutorials all over. You can just Google Sinopia and you'll find no shortage of them. And it's neat. Set up your own registry and give it a shot. It's pretty cool. So another solution that you have to this registry is NPM Enterprise. So really there's two parts to NPM Enterprise. They call it NPM org, but really it's just Enterprise that they host. So basically that's when you start scoping modules or using namespace, and that allows you to get private modules. The issue with NPM org is that, yes, now you can store private modules, but it's still being handled by NPM. So you're still at the whim of a third-party service. So now you can use org and spin up a private registry for just the caching, but at that point, what's the point? But NPM Enterprise does offer a behind the firewall solution, so you can install it, locally, and again set up that caching layer to the public registry, so you can get that mirroring effect, and you get all the same things, right? So it's an enterprise private registry. You still get to cache public NPM modules. You still have the ability to whitelist and blacklist. You get a more advanced search and a dashboard that will show you more usage on the modules. You get to search like keywords just like you would with NPM public. So it's pretty cool. You can spring the money. And you can just find that at npmjs.com/enterprise. As a matter of fact, I think I have the links for all of these things here. So yeah, here's Sinopia. Enterprise. So the next solution is actually called Artifactory by a company, jFrog. And what separates them from Sinopia and NPM Enterprise is that they don't just do node modules. It's actually an artifact registry. So you can also put Docker containers, Java builds, tars, pretty much anything that you consider an artifact, you can store it. And even with Artifactory, so you get the registry plus the other artifact registries. It's still going to cache the public NPM modules for you. You can also whitelist and blacklist modules. And you get a more advanced search and dashboard with jFrog or Artifactory as well. And that is at jfrog.com/artifactory, and I have it right here. So it's a much bigger solution than the other ones. And if you're going to be using Docker, or you have, Java packages that you're building, or, just pretty much building any type of artifacts, I'd say it's definitely worth a look. And I'll drop the link for that in as well. Cool. So these are some of the solutions that we have. So now we've gotten to the point we can write great modules, we can store great modules, but we want to integrate some of these principles into our workflow, and we want some tools to help us do these things faster and easier. So a couple of tools that can really help you out. The first one is called JSInspect. And so this is to help mitigate duplication. So remember I was saying that code discovery is not just external, it's also internal. You know, aside from being able to look into other parts of our company and have insight into what outside software we have, we also want to know what's inside of our application and what we can reuse there. So JSInspect is a great tool that will just help you discover duplications of code. And it has settings that allow you to make it loose or granular. So you can kind of get wide and search for patterns, and you can get pretty specific and get to start looking at functions that have almost the same signature, like the same function called signature, and it will show you those comparisons as well. I believe I have links to all this stuff, so I'm just going to keep dropping links. Yeah, so that's a great solution for looking internal. You know, and again, you would want to maybe set a threshold and run this as part of your build. You know, you can run it locally. You know, there's editor plugins for it, so you know you can get this feedback at any part of the workflow that you want. And obviously, the faster the feedback, the better. You have integration, Code Climate Duplication Engine. So I talked about using Code Climate yesterday for measuring the quality of the code, as in, is it adhering to our style guide, and for just reporting on test coverage that you can generate. And I'll cover that when I think we're going to add another webinar on testing, and I'll be covering that. But they also have another engine that you can enable, which is a duplication engine. And so this is basically just like JSInspect, except you're going to get this feedback here in Code Climate, which gives better visibility, right? It takes it from being local or lost in the build logs and makes this information available to everybody. And then also you can set thresholds, and you can actually fail builds if you start to discover too much duplication. Let's see. And so here's the docs for the actual engine. But it's actually very easy to enable in your configuration for Code Climate, and they have that documentation on their site. So speaking of, they have very good API documentation. It's very easy to use Code Climate because they make their service discoverable. So now moving out of local and starting to get more into some of the areas we talked about, talking about documentation. One of the easiest things that I've ever used is Swagger. It's a great way to document APIs and services. As a matter of fact, if you want to get like complete automated like live documentation, you should really try using Happy, Joy, and Happy Swagger plugin. And it is just like Utopia. So basically, Happy is the server. You use Joy anyway with it to validate data that's coming in, parameters coming in. But the Swagger plugin for Happy will read those Joy schemas because you build these schemas, and it generates documentation. So what you specify that the API accepts, it builds that documentation for you. And as a matter of fact, that awesome enterprise web service repo that I shared, if you actually go into the wiki and do the getting started and go through setting it up, it uses this pattern, and the Swagger documentation is generated, and you can view it. And it's great. So your API, you get free documentation. So as you can imagine, that's a big boost to velocity. We know it's not stale, and you can do a lot more with Swagger. So basically, really what it boils down to is Swagger is a DSL. So it's like its own language, its own like basic language, and then you can convert those kind of Swagger schemas in different programs can even read it to build routes, like for Express plugins, so then it will add your routes to Express or Happy, things like that. And then in the reverse, can read routes and generate documentation from it. So it's pretty powerful. And it goes way beyond just JavaScript. It's actually Swagger's available for a ton of languages. So moving on, getting into code documentation, we have one of the ones that's pretty popular right now is JSDoc. It's one of the best solutions that I had found. I'm actually investigating a new one that we're going to talk about in a second. But this is what we tend to use the most right now. It's very good. It works with ES5. It's loose in its structure, and it's easy to build your own templates for the display. So it makes it a pretty good choice because, you know, JavaScript, you can build things 100 ways, and a lot of previous documentation implementations were based off other languages, which are very object-oriented. But, you know, a lot of JavaScript, you know, you're starting to see this big push to functional. And so it's just having tools like this that are so diverse make it, you know, much easier to be able to go in and use the same tool to document, you know, 5 different types of code bases. So we have a link for that as well. Okay. The next solution that I want to discuss is called RTYPE. So this is put together by one of my favorite developers, Eric Elliott. I really love him. He pushes the status quo. He has a great outlook, in my opinion, on object-oriented JavaScript and object composition in JavaScript and functional programming in JavaScript. He has great resources. Here's a plug for him, unintentional, but he has tutorials. I suggest that, I mean, they do cost, but, you know, if you can afford it, there's some of the best lessons you'll get. He's also on Medium and has like some decent amount of that information for free on Medium. I would recommend checking him out. But RTYPE basically gives you, you're defining types, but this is your documentation. So instead of doing like these block comments with at this and at that, you're actually writing what feels like ES5 or ES6. So it's less intrusive into your workflow. It reads easier. It's a bit easier to understand. And you're actually typing your code as you do this too. So it's pretty interesting. And then there's a plugin that he's working on that literally will read your types to generate this RTYPE documentation. So it is on my radar because that is something that is pretty good because I've been looking at types a lot too. Speaking of flow, as we said, types are basically a level of documentation. So I know that this function bar is going to take X and it's going to return, well, in this case, they're showing a broken example, but, you know, we would expect it to return a string, you know, and generally you would set, you know, X as being a specific type. So we know what we can feed it and what it's going to get out. So basically it becomes our example usage, right? We don't have to show examples because we're telling them exactly what it takes and exactly what it gives back. And again, this is just like having a test, right? So actually, there's a big disparity. I still believe heavily in tests. I think you need them. But a lot of people are saying, like a lot of TypeScript users especially, that if you have types, there's a large decrease in the number of bugs that make it into production that normally do in a dynamic language. And it alleviates the need for as much testing, and it's faster to write types. So therein, types equal better than tests. I think you could use both. I actually don't like types unless a project is very large. If you have a larger service or something like that, I think types are great. If you're building node modules and you're using types, you're going to be adding complexity to these modules. It's going to be harder for people to contribute to them. It's also going to make it harder for people to read if they're not up on types. So it's something you want to be easy, you know, and careful with. However, if you are building like a large application, I do recommend types because, you know, I'm sure we've all been in the spots where we get something and it comes through as undefined and we're like, what? Like, how is this thing undefined? Like, it's supposed to be this. These get caught, you know, before they get out. So it's definitely something to at least think about. So coming up on the last tool that I want to talk about, and this helps us with SEMVAR, is a tool called SEMANTIC-RELEASE. So instead of you having to decide, is this a patch release? Is this a major release? And going through commits, looking at what was changed, And seeing that, what it does is if you just use a couple simple keywords in your commit messages like chore, fix, feature, semantic release will read those commits and then give you the smallest version back, type of update that you can get away with for those changes. Generates a change log for you with the commits. You can build plugins to do this, like, to check all different things. I'm actually looking at adding some plugins that will do like a final packaging step before it releases for us. So, it's definitely a very powerful tool. But just the biggest part is relieving the pain of having to figure out what version am I about to release. Is this a major? Is it a minor? Is it a patch? Leave it up to semantic release. So this one was just a few minutes shorter than yesterday. Code discovery is a topic that doesn't get a ton of discussion, but it's actually something that's extremely important once you get into a company that uses a lot of JavaScript. Now, not so much if you're using a lot of third-party JavaScript, but the more services you build, the more internal tools you write, the more bots you build, Slack bots, all these different things, they really need to be managed. If you don't start to do these things and make code more discoverable, you just end up with these snowflakes. You have this Slack bot that is just all custom code. This other service, it's all custom code, and a UI that's all custom code. And every time you're just starting from scratch and rebuilding the entire thing. And you're wasting a lot of time. Time that you could be building, and a lot of times following these patterns, you'll see things become generic enough that you can open source them as a team, which is great. It's a great feeling and fun, but be careful. Open sourcing is a double-edged sword. It's great, gets you out there, and it feels great to contribute and do that, but don't forget you're putting the responsibility on the company to maintain that software. If it picks up steam and people start using it, you now added that. So now not only are you focusing internally, but now you have to focus on open source. So be careful. I definitely still advocate it. We want to give back. We use open source technology all the time. So when we can, we do it. But what I tend to do a lot of times and say, like, does MLS, does Major League Soccer need to maintain this? Or should I just like release it under mine, or, let somebody release it under theirs? We don't really care so much like whose name it's under. But that might be something you want to do. Maybe you're willing to take on the responsibility of something open source, but just be careful before you put that responsibility on your company. So with that ending note, I'm going to open up floor for QA to see if we get any questions coming in. And so I'll go ahead and give a minute to do that. And while people are thinking and processing, real quick, this was part 2 of a series that is 4 right now, but we're looking at adding 1 to 2 more. And so yesterday was code quality, today is code discovery. In 2 weeks, we'll be coming back and we'll be talking about securing your environment and deploying with Docker. And these pretty much get you through the rest. Aside from testing, I feel like testing is important here. Once you have those bases covered, I mean, you're pretty much ready to, once you tie all that together, to move fast, build services, build modules, put them into a pipeline, get a good release process going, automate this, and man, just the speed that it gives you, it's something I never thought that I'd be able to attain. And at Major League Soccer, so right now we're 2 developers and 1 DevOps, and we maintain like, I don't even know how many services, and we are stretched a little tight right now, but we're trying to hire for 1 person, and that will be enough. Like that will be enough. And we have like at least 20 node services, probably, I don't even know how many internal packages. And then we have like internal tooling. We contribute to open source. So, it's more code than you would ever think that you would deal with in a week. And for us to be able to move through projects seamlessly and have these repeatable build, deploy, build, test, deploy patterns and have these things in place allow us to spin up new projects very fast, iterate on them very fast, and move on to other things very fast. Also, a little heads up, I will be speaking at O'Reilly Software Architecture Conference coming up in November. I'll be doing a 90-minute presentation where basically I take all these pieces that I'm talking about, but give you a very finite guide on how to get from I'm building something to I'm releasing something into production. Talking about a lot of things from monitoring and ops, testing, deployments, all that stuff. It's really going to bring it full circle. And so coming back to Q&A, I'm seeing no questions. So I'm going to say at this time, if you guys would be so kind as to fill out that last poll, let me know how you think. Oh, sorry. Got one question coming in. Sorry, again. Huh. Okay, sorry. I thought it was a question, just a message, but okay. So how's it going, Gerardo? We're glad to have you. I'm sorry that you were late, but just a heads up, no worries. This is recorded, so you can watch it all. Also, the slides as well are also online. So feel free to grab those and pick those up, and take a look at those. And again, I've dropped these links in here. So take a look at these and do some searching, check out some Medium articles, things like that. But yeah, so yeah, if you guys could fill out that last poll for me on how you thought the webinar went, it would be much appreciated. Also, a quick note, I'm going to drop my email again into chat because we are hiring for a junior JavaScript engineer to come on board at Major League Soccer. So feel free to shoot me a line. If you have, don't worry, we will be reaching out to people. These are going directly up to our director of engineering, and he'll get with you. He's a busy guy, so just give us some time. But yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Again, you have my email. You know what? Like, if you have some questions or stuff, don't spam me too hard. But feel free, shoot me out a line. I'm on Twitter. You can always hit me up on Twitter. I'm going to open up an AMA GitHub repo soon, so you'll be able to ask me anything there. And yeah, stay in touch. Come back in 2 weeks. We're going to continue this on. Oh, we got a question from Alex. Cool. Quick question, how Sinopia or Artifactory relates to something like shrink wrap? Great question. Okay, so when you use shrink wrap, it's actually telling it to use a specific version and it specifies where the resource comes from. So in most cases, that's going to be pointing at NPM public registry. However, if you are using like a .npm RC or using the registry NPM flag on the command line, you can specify a different registry, and shrink wrap will read that and actually wrap up from those resources. So to answer your question, even when you shrink wrap, instead of pointing at public, it's going to be pointing at Sinopia or Artifactory. It's going to point at that private repository that you give it a URL to. And so if you just Google NPM, .npm RC or npm private registry, you'll get the answers. It's going to be like right at the top of Google. I hope that helps. Do you still need shrink wrap? Well, yes, because your versioning in most cases in your package JSON are going to be loose. So when you actually call, even though it's cached, after a while, it's going to check for an update. So you could actually npm, next time you npm install, if there's a new version, you could end up still getting a newer version of the dependency than what you're expecting. So you still want to shrink wrap because that's still going to lock down those dependencies for you. Okay, cool. Awesome. Good. Yeah, so we have any other questions? I'm going to let this run out for another minute or two. In the meantime, if not, it's been a pleasure. I hope you guys found this, extremely useful. And we're going to wrap up. I'm just going to let the silence set in. All right, guys, and with that, looks like we got a clean hour. Doesn't seem like we have any more questions. Any productivity tips you use to not be distracted at work? That's a good question. Man, distractions are tough, and that is Yeah, or personal projects. Yeah, sure. You know, distractions are one of the hardest things that you're going to face. People ask me questions. I'm a pretty big go-to guy. I love to help people out. It's very tough to eliminate distractions. So instead of trying to focus on eliminating distractions, because it's going to be very hard to do, aside from if you can get chunks where you can go sit somewhere remote, away from the team or something, or turn on your do not disturb on Slack, maybe set a calendar time, block out a calendar time, and put yourself as busy for a couple hours. But other than that, instead of trying to eliminate the distractions, look for other ways to increase velocity and make it easier for you to deal with those distractions, right? Like, so if we're taking these patterns and these practices that we're talking about and we're putting them into these applications, it's going to get much easier for you to get back into the code. When it's the same type of pattern repeated over and over, I know that sounds like it would kind of get boring, but it doesn't, as long as you get to build interesting things still. But it makes it very easy to hop around, step back for a minute and come back. But really, I don't have a good solution for what happens when people just destroy that state that's in your head. It's really up to your team lead or you guys as a team. If you feel you're getting distracted too much, hopefully it's a place where you can say that, and actually make that known, and that's an okay thing, and that happens. And then once it's known, then processes can start to be put in place. Like our director of engineering is very good at fielding. We have like a small team that actually takes in requests, client requests, things like that, or even bug reports before they get to us, that reviews these things and stuff, and it helps eliminate the distractions. But you can't eliminate them all. We're in an open floor plan. People can just walk right up to me. So what I try and do is just maximize my time and make myself more efficient when I am able to work on code. Do we have a standard project setup that you give new developers to set up their laptops? Yes, we do. So we have a repository called RTFM that we call Read the Fine Manual. But in that, it has a developer setup guide. It has a developer setup script that is a bash script that will install most of the software that you need, pull down the most important GitHub repositories onto your machine, set up stuff for AWS credentials, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, we do that. You just have to be very careful. You have to make sure that that does not get stale. And it's great. So what we do is when we are going to onboard, we take a step back and we go through like, all right, so, is this still up to date? Is this good? And there are solutions that do it better than a bash script. But we feel that works for us. Most people are pretty custom. We're pretty loose. We don't force a particular IDE or a particular this or that or VPN client, but we do just do the things that you can't get around. We do install that and set that up for you. But again, that's choice. If you want to do it by hand, we also have the instructions on how to do it by hand. Okay, so no more questions coming in. I think we're going to wrap up right here. And I appreciate everybody for coming in and taking part of this webinar, and part of the series. Come back in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about securing your environment. Very cool stuff there. This is going to talk about securing dependencies, securing your runtime, packaging your application, JWTs. Yeah, actually, we're going to talk about authentication and authorization. We are going to talk about that. Yep. So yeah, we're going to cover some good stuff. So I look forward to seeing you guys then. Thank you so much.